Well, Winston asked me this morning to introduce you to a remarkable man who wrote a remarkable book. The man, Russell Kirk, who is from Augusta, Michigan, as you've heard, and you've met his wife, and the book, The Conservative Mind. Now, Russell Kirk was arguably the most important conservative in America in the 20th century. And if you go back to 1953, when The Conservative Mind was published, it sent a shockwave through American life and discourse with the conversations that it started. And I'm going to tell you why in just a minute. But 7 editions later, the book has proven so resilient that the New York Times calls it the Conservative Bible. Now, that's the last time in this talk that I'm going to mention the New York Times and the Conservative Bible in one sentence. Now, the first time I encountered Russell Kirk was not in the classroom, but of all places in East Berlin. I was studying Fulbright there. I had a year to go. I was at about the 6-month mark. And in East Berlin, I had grown to hate all of the gray oppression behind the Iron Curtain. And I couldn't come home physically, but I needed to come home spiritually. So I went to a little bookstore by Checkpoint Charlie there in East Berlin. And I was looking for the best book I could find that the communists love to hate. And it didn't take me long as I was leafing through the books to find that they kept hating Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind. And I thought that this was a badge of honor. And I knew from that moment on that Russell Kirk would always be on my bookshelf for being the target of that communist venom. It's a challenge to say something new about a book that has generated so much comment over the last 60 years. And as I reread the work to prepare for this morning's talk, it struck me that so many of the conservative principles that Russell talked about have been powerfully ratified by historical experience over the succeeding decades since 1953. And what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of insight into the book itself, tell you about the central figure in that book, and then tell you about just a couple of, let's go through a couple or 3 of the principles that have been ratified by history. Okay, so first, a little bit of background about the conservative mind. The book is actually written as a doctoral dissertation. Now, don't let that fool you. Don't let that turn you off. The work in its published form becomes a stylistic masterpiece, again, with this very powerful thesis at its time, and it has this compelling story arc that puts an 18th century parliamentarian, Edmund Burke, at the center. Now, Burke is a remarkable human being who wrote across the canon. He wrote a number of works that would be of interest to you. But he also ran with one of the greatest generations of thinkers ever, including, of course, the American founders, who would have been the same generation. Remember, the American founders, Patrick Henry included, would have been British at the time that they were born. Burke understood 2 things that I want to share with you this morning. First, that civilization is fragile. The overwhelming majority of civilizations have disappeared from the scene. He asked the question, how was it that Britain in the 18th century became the freest, most powerful, most prosperous nation on the earth? What first principles did its statesmen live by to guide it? What traditions did it carry on? Well, in defending what made Britain great and advising people to avoid what would tear it down, namely at that time the threat of the French Revolution, Edmund Burke becomes the father of modern conservatism as we know it. He created, as somebody on the Imaginative Conservative recently said, he created the ism that was meant to stop other isms. Now let's fast forward 200 years to Russell Kirk. Now compared to Edmund Burke, Kirk grows up in an even more revolutionary time. He was born in 1988 as the First World War was grinding to a halt. They're in the wastelands of the Western Front. And out of the mud and the blood of those trenches in the wasteland would arise a jungle of isms. Now you know, for example, that some of those isms that Burke had to deal with, industrialism and the French Revolution and all the threats at that time were bad, but by comparison, Leninism, Stalinism, Nazism. Here in America by the 1930s, we didn't have the violence of those isms, but we did have a gloating liberalism. A liberalism that had become smug in the 30s and in the 1940s. Every free society is going to have a party of innovation in addition to a party of conservation. And the tension between those two, both Burke and Kirk recognized, is essential to the discussion of how we reform. But as Edmund Burke said, the statesman, the good statesman, is going to know how to reform and balance the needs in that tension between the party of innovation and the party of conservation. In the 1930s, after the Great Depression and the laws that were enacted in the New Deal, we were definitely in the party of innovation mode. I think conservatives were reduced to muttering, "Cheer up, for the worst is yet to come." Intellectually, cutting-edge liberals were saying that conservatism was essentially dead. Now, I'm not making this up. Lionel Trilling, literary critic, the famous critic from Columbia University, said that conservatism had been reduced to irritable mental gestures. The cultural critic, Theodor Adorno, originally from Germany, who immigrates to the United States, actually argued that conservatism was a psychological disorder that arose from the authoritarian personality. Now, I think sometimes my 3 teenage boys would agree with that statement. Culturally, innovation was afoot in America at that time. Culturally, you had, I think, a striking juxtaposition. Now, The Conservative Mind is going to be published, remember, in 1953 by Henry Regnery in Chicago. Just a few blocks away, another publication was going to premiere. Hugh Hefner and his Playboy philosophy were coming out with their first issue of Playboy magazine with that famous cover of Marilyn Monroe on it. What a striking juxtaposition between the conservative mind and this cultural expression of liberalism. Politically, in the 1930s and 1940s, of course, the FDR's New Deal coalition had succeeded in shifting Americans' thought away from classical liberalism to more of a social liberalism. Classical liberalism teaches that we have individual rights and that as citizens we need to be protected from an aggressive state. Socialism changes the terms of what liberalism means. It adds social justice to the mix, and it also says that the government, the federal government namely, should intervene in the economy. Remember, Russell Kirk in the 1930s is a teenager. He is watching classical liberalism morph into social liberalism. And he's seeing then that really conservatives continue to be on the defensive, and this is why after he writes his manuscript, The Conservative Mind, and takes it to Chicago, he wants to call the book The Conservative Rout. It seemed that conservatism was on its back and defeated. But once the book came out, something remarkable happened. When people started reading what Kirk's actual thesis was, they were amazed to see a new expression of what had made the American character. It comes out in May of 1953 at a cost of $6.50. And the critics saw that Kirk's great achievement in the conservative mind was to go beyond equating the American character with just classical liberalism or just social liberalism. It was to go beyond equating everything good in the Enlightenment with America, because Kirk was onto something new in American letters. He saw that the American character was not just defined by liberalism, but he discovered a golden thread, a third grounding of our character, as it were, in thought that began with Edmund Burke in Britain, and at the same time with John Adams, another great founder we should mention this morning. John Adams on this side of the ocean. And this golden thread would link a number of important thinkers in the American character: de Tocqueville, Melville, Hawthorne, T.S. Eliot. And what joined these thinkers was their grasp of the permanent things: truth, goodness, beauty, justice, order, freedom. These were rooted, as Burke had apprehended, as Kirk reasserted, these were rooted not just in the Enlightenment, they go way back farther. They go back in our Judeo-Christian experience, they go back into our Greco-Roman experience with civilization. It turns out, Kirk saw, that we moderns were standing not entirely on our own, but on the shoulders of ancient giants. Now, this was a powerful thesis in 1953, and it remains a powerful thesis this day. And as I was preparing for this morning's talk, I wondered if Kirk's reading of Burke actually was reinforced by the childhood impressions of his youth when he was growing up in Plymouth. And so I got in the car, I drove from Grand Rapids over to Plymouth, Michigan, and I walked around the town. The town, Plymouth, of course, is named after Plymouth, Massachusetts. It has a village green, and there I saw, around the village green, the churches that were teaching an ancient faith. You saw the schools that were teaching the Greco-Roman understanding of our experience as human beings. You saw the war monuments. I see Winston Elliott IV here, Captain Elliott. You saw the war monuments that spoke of civic virtue and communal sacrifice. So all of the lessons, the book lessons that were coming out of the conservative mind, you see, and all the things that he had read in Burke, they were already there, in a sense, deep inside, from growing up in Plymouth, Michigan. It also occurred to me that there is high irony in the fact that Russell Kirk comes from Plymouth. Now, this is a thing that, I'm a native Houstonian, but I learned quickly up in Michigan that they hold their hands up like this. It's a Michigan thing, so bear with me. But he comes from Plymouth, and Plymouth is on the outskirts of Detroit. Detroit, of course, the city that's going to supercharge modernity, arguably more than any other city in the United States. There he is on the outskirts looking into this supercharged modernity of Detroit in the same way that he's going to spend his life really looking on the outskirts of modernity, looking in and examining it, of course not wistfully, but analytically and critically. After his doctorate, Russell Kirk completed at St. Andrews and some teaching at Michigan State, Kirk left the academy in East Lansing. So you see, he was there in Plymouth, outskirts of Detroit, then East Lansing. Then he goes up to Mecosta, which is going to be the outskirts, as it were, to Michigan's stump country, which had been ravaged by loggers. He went to his family's ancestral home up in Mecosta, which has been referred to several times already this morning. That's where he could write. Now, I said that it struck me a few moments ago, I said it, that the Burkean principles articulated in the conservative mind are not just abstractions, but they really have been powerfully ratified by the history of the United States since the appearance of the book in 1953. Think about it. Just a few years after the Allies' victory in a two-front war, a world war that, by the way, we were in and out of in 3 years, 9 months. Two-front war. Put that in perspective, considering some of our recent engagements. Kirk wrote the book that sympathetic reviewers regarded as an act of cultural recovery. In taking stock of Western civilization, Kirk, of course, makes Edmund Burke the protagonist, the person at the center of this work, and he does so in response to a stunning failure of leadership in Europe and in Asia, and also in our country, for people who refused to look at the historic reality of what was going on in the 1930s and 40s in the wake of the First World War. Right from the start, in the very first chapter, Kirk argued that we needed to cultivate statesmen in the Burkean mold, men and women who combined a disposition to preserve with the ability to reform. Again, that balancing of the party of conservation with the party of innovation. Underlying Kirk's call for Burkean statesmanship were two important principles of conservative thought that he lays out right there in the first chapter. And the first one is, again, getting back to this idea of the fragility of civilization. Civilizations last when their best laws and customs and traditions are passed on from generation to generation. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what education does. That's what the Free Enterprise Institute does. That's what this organization is about. And the second principle that's so important to understanding Burke and Kirk and the conservative mind is to realize that even though innovation may be exciting, It may be attractive to the young. Not all change is good. You have to look at the change with a discerning eye. One must measure the costs, for as Burke said, the individual is foolish, but the species is wise. Those two principles add up to what the statesman, the kind of statesman we need today, and we needed certainly in the 1950s when Kirk was writing. Now, during the second decade of the book's existence, the notorious 60s, America and the West underwent a cultural revolution that was quite unusual in world history, because many of America's elite were turning against their very own roots that had made their elite work possible. It was one of the first generations, the only generations in human history that actually turned against the religious roots of the civilization. Exactly 10 years after the book's publication, so in 1963, school-sponsored prayer was banned by the Supreme Court, and many of the best and the brightest Americans, especially younger Americans, were abandoning their Judeo-Christian faith traditions for Zen Buddhism, TM, LSD, peyote, and a pagan-based environmental movement. During the 60s Cultural Revolution, people who read The Conservative Mind could see that Kirk was talking about a lot more than politics. At a deeper level, he was arguing for those three great transcendentals that I mentioned a minute ago. Truth, goodness, beauty. Stephen mentioned them. Winston's mentioned them. He was saying what is on the words that are on your program this morning, saying, quote, the conservative is concerned, first of all, with the regeneration of the spirit and character, with the perennial problem of the inner order of the soul, the restoration of ethical understanding, and the religious sanction upon which any life worth living is founded. This is conservatism at its highest. Close quote. So this book is written to shore up the potential disintegration in American culture that by the 1960s was starting to manifest itself. Burke is arguing that any discussion of left and right inevitably is going to involve a discussion of above and below. This, I would argue, is the most important conservative Burkean principle in the conservative mind. Now, the third decade of the book's existence, the 1970s, were tough. Tough in a different way from the 60s. You had a confrontation with our defeat in Vietnam, politically generated energy crises, environmental catastrophes, corruption in the White House. The 70s were also the decade when Americans were living with stagflation. Remember the misery index? We had a high misery index. And the erosion of their property. In this case, property in the form of income. And think of that Texan that I encountered on the elevator in the 16th Amendment. All of Kirk's life, there had been high marginal tax rates on income. Remember that Franklin Roosevelt tried to impose a 100% tax rate on marginal income in the 1940s. Under Carter, it was still as high as 70%. Now, such oppressive taxation represented a striking erosion, not only of property, but of freedom. Thus, the 70s made Americans alive. It gave us a tutorial in the Burkean principle that freedom and property are closely linked. As Kirk reminded us, the power to tax is indeed the power to destroy. Yes, maybe President Obama could read this book. By the book's fourth decade, in the 1980s, Russell Kirk was hailed for having inspired conservatism's comeback. He and a coterie of thinkers who have really been game changers in our intellectual and cultural life. For the first time in living memory, conservatives were once again on the A-list of the she party circuit in Washington, D.C. and New York. We see how the movement climbed from obscurity to power. If you go back to Senator Robert Taft from Ohio back in the late 40s and the early 50s, and then you take the defeat of Goldwater in 1964, and then you take finally the landslide victory of Ronald Reagan in 1980. You see this remarkable response to this game-changing awareness that conservatism is part of our tradition and the best part of it. And the American people's response to the high taxes, I think, vindicates Reagan in 1980. And the 40th president, by the way, would bring down that marginal tax rate from 70% to 28%. Now, the Republican Party is an imperfect vehicle for conveying conservative thoughts, principles, and traditions. We know that. But in one area in the 1980s, it did something brilliant under Reagan's leadership. It put forth a compelling vision of the Soviet Union as an inhumane regime that was destined for the ash heap of history. And in fact, around the 30th anniversary of the conservative mind, just a few days before, Ronald Reagan went to Orlando, Florida, and he addressed the National Association of Evangelicals with a now famous speech, the Evil Empire speech, 1983. Liberals thought Reagan, remember this? Liberals thought Reagan was crazy to say such a thing, much less think it. That our 40th president was daft. I remember the editorial cartoons right after this, where Reagan's name was spelled Ray-Gun, as a way to dismiss him. But guess what? Our 40th president, by the end of the decade, was vindicated. And you look by 1989, November 9th, 1989, when that Berlin Wall falls down, and you look at that remarkable month of December 1991, when the Soviet Union as an empire implodes on itself. And along the way, another Burkean principle is ratified. Human beings will never achieve perfection on this earth. This was just said by a previous speaker. Despite all the coffeehouse debates by the ideologues and the visionaries, we will never achieve utopia, not in this earth. And the idea of the new Soviet man or a great Aryan race proved to be nonsense in theory and dangerous in practice. These ideas to refute that kind of thinking can be found in the pages of the conservative mind, thus vindicating what Burke had said in the 18th century and what Kirk was reasserting in the 20th century, and that Reagan was in a historic position actually to implement. Well, I think I'm running a little bit short on time now, so I'm not going to take you through the 90s and then from 2003 and the fifth and the sixth decades of the book's existence. But I do want to reiterate here that these Burkean principles that are found throughout Kirk's book, again, they're not just abstractions from coffee houses. They've been ratified by historical experience, and they've inspired, I think, a lot of people to pick up the book once again and read it. Let me conclude on this. One of the things that Russell Kirk was famous for was planting trees. Remember, he was from the area of Michigan, the Mecosta area, which was called the Stump Country. It was called the Stump Country because loggers had gone through after the Great Fire of Chicago in the 1870s. Chicago needed to be rebuilt. Turns out 20% of the lumber that rebuilt Chicago came from places like Mecosta. Russell Kirk moves back up there, and he plants trees. And in planting trees, he sets an example for all of us, I think. Because I see Annette Kirk planting trees. She literally plants trees. You ought to be in Mecosta and see the beautiful home, and the landscape there is beautiful, as all those trees are now redeeming that old ravaged landscape. But she's planting trees in our culture. And I look at how the growth of those trees has influenced so many people, the network that Winston talked about. So Annette Kirk's Russell Kirk Center is doing this. I look at Winston Elliott and the Free Enterprise Institute, and I look at the Imaginative Conservative, and I look at how that's another tree that's planted and spreading like crazy. I look at Barbara Elliott, and I think of the Russell Kirk Forum over at Houston Baptist University, another tree that's planted, a tree with strong roots and that's growing and inspiring us and feeding us. And I'm looking out here at the young people, and I'm wondering what trees you will plant. And I just got to say, thank goodness for a Free Enterprise Institute. Thank goodness for Imaginative Conservative. Thank you, my friend Winston, for the work you do to make these trees, this growth possible. Thank you very much.